With the 110th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme looming close, the podcast is going to focus on this aspect of the Great War over the coming weeks, including some live reporting via our YouTube channel from the Somme battlefields during the anniversary period itself in late June and early July. So please make sure you subscribe to us over there on YouTube and keep an eye on social media. For the podcast coverage of the anniversary, this episode is the first of three looking at the British front on that first day of the Battle of the Somme, the 1st of July 1916, and breaking it down into three sectors: Somme North, Somme Central and Somme South. For each of them, we'll look at what happened in those areas, who was fighting there, what happened on the 1st of July, and what the outcome was. And rather than a detailed history of each area, which in reality could cover many podcasts, it's kind of my thoughts on these parts of the Somme, my views, how I've seen them over the years, and through that, a kind of virtual collective journey that we'll make together into these areas where fighting was more than a century ago. And we've covered elements of each of these areas in many previous podcasts. So if listening to these episodes, your interest is piqued in a specific area, search for an episode relating to that in the podcast back catalogue, which is now approaching something like 300 episodes, incredibly. And in terms of some of the sources used for this, aside from my own journey across those Somme fields over more than 40 years, and the many Somme veterans I interviewed back in the 1980s and 90s, along with countless hours in the archives and many hundreds of books, many of which surround me now as I record this, I thought that it would be useful to give some heads up on some books that I'd recommend to take your own study forward. The first of these is The Official History, Military Operations, France and Belgium 1916, Volume 1 by Brigadier General Sir James Edmonds, originally published in 1932. This was one of many official history volumes for the Great War on the Western Front, with 2 for 1914, 2 for 15, 2 for 16, 3 for 1917, and I think something like 5 for 1918. They took a long time to write. The early ones, 1914, 15, 16, tend to be slightly better than some of the later ones, although that's not universally true. But a lot of the early ones had separate map volumes as well. And for the 1916 Volume 1, there's an excellent map volume that shows all of the different sectors on the 1st of July 1916 and the location of the units that attacked that day. So it's an incredibly useful source to kind of lay that information over the landscape as it is today. Now, the official history is an official history. It's not light reading. You are not going to kind of get the same out of this as you would with perhaps some other books on the Somme, but it's there as a kind of base level. Lots of detail, units, sometimes individuals mentioned in there, casualty statistics. Often there's reference to what was happening on the other side of the battlefield, the other side of no man's land, with information on the German units that were fighting in those areas. So it's a starting point in many, many ways. And that volume has been reprinted several times. There was a really nice reprint in the 1980s with a colour cover. Battery Press did one. I think Naval Military Press also have done a reprint of these. So they're not difficult to get hold of. Now that's the kind of starting level. Of course, there are so many books about the Battle of the Somme, but I'd recommend, of course, Martin Middlebrook's First Day of the Somme and Andrew MacDonald's more recent book of the same title. It's not a rewrite, Andrew MacDonald's book. It is a fresh approach from a modern perspective. But again, a bit like the official history, Middlebrook's First Day of the Somme is another starting point for anyone with an interest in this subject. And although that book is many decades old now, I still think it holds up really, really well and would recommend it thoroughly, as I would Andrew MacDonald's book as well. Barry Cattell's One Day on the Somme, which he self-published in the 1990s, it's a little spiral-bound book, And a bit like we're doing here in this podcast, he breaks the 1st of July down into the different sectors and he gives a kind of summary of it. Again, perhaps you're not going to find much more than you would in the official history, combined with Middlebrook and some others, but it is a useful kind of aid memoir and a useful approach to understanding it. I think all of these help us build up these layers of understanding of a subject like the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Chris McCarthy, who worked at the Imperial War Museum for many years, back in the late 80s, early 90s, published the Somme Day by Day, where he did a daily account of British operations, British and Commonwealth operations on the Somme, and essentially kind of indexed to a certain degree the official history, broke it down into little chunks, so you can refer to this book and see what the major operations were taking place on each of the 141 days of the Battle of the Somme, with obviously a heavy emphasis on the very beginning. Some good illustrations in there, and he included the official history maps. And I think there's a more recent reprint of this where the maps are actually in colour, so worth getting for that. And then another layer of this, which kind of brings in lots of other sources, memoirs, regimental histories, private accounts, is Gerald Gliddon's Somme 1916, originally published under the name When the Barrage Lifts, and sitting side by side with that is Paul Kendall's Somme 1916, which is a really good overview of the Somme battlefields with, again, a lot of first-hand accounts in it. So there's a few books to keep you busy and to make you poor. I mean, we can never have enough books, of course, but those are a good starting point for an understanding of a subject like the 1st of July 1916, and there's many others that you can find. So in this first episode, looking at Somme North, we're going to be focusing, as we are in all of the episodes, on the 4th Army sector, 4th Army commanded by General Sir Henry Rawlinson, which will take us in this episode from Serre via Beaumont-Hamel to Thiepval. Somme Central, the next episode, will look at Overlaz to La Boisselle and Fricourt, and Somme South, Mametz to Montauban. I haven't included Gommecourt in this series, as it's an area we've looked at a lot in previous podcast episodes, and while part of the battle, of course, a diversionary attack, it was outside of the 4th Army main area, and if you want to find out more about that, have a look at the back catalogue, and we've got a YouTube video about Gommecourt on the Old Frontline channel. So, let's begin. We start our journey for Somme North at the village of Serre. Serre and Beaumont-Hamel, which we're going to look at, were both part of the 8th Corps. Corps were part of the structure of the British Expeditionary Force on the Western Front. You have 4th Army at one level, then beneath that you have corps made up of a number of divisions, and within the division you have the individual brigades and the different battalions and all the support troops as well. It's kind of a family tree of organisation of how the British Army operated in places like the Western Front. And this 8th Corps here at Serre and Beaumont-Hamel was under the command of Lieutenant General Sir Alma Hunter Weston. Hunter Weston had fought since the very beginning of the war. He'd fought on the Western Front in 1914 in the more mobile war, and then at Gallipoli, and was now a corps commander by the time of the Somme. Often nicknamed Hunter Bunter, not necessarily highly regarded, and if you look at critical books on command in the Great War, you won't find many favourable reports on him. But a few years ago I was looking at some of the correspondence between him and the families of some of those officers, including senior officers, who were killed on the first day of the Somme, and it gave me a slightly different perspective on him in that he comes across as a very human individual, which he doesn't always come across in that way as the commander of a big organisation like this. But generalship, that whole kind of layer of understanding the first day of the Battle of the Somme, is really a subject in its own right. And we begin in this northern area of the Somme battlefields, actually what is today just officially outside the department of the Somme at Serre, which is in the Pas-de-Calais today. But such distinctions were not made in 1916, however, and really meant nothing to the troops of either side. So officially, the village of Serre, Serre-les-Puisieux, was the northernmost area attacked by the British Army in the main 4th Army assault on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the 1st of July 1916. And what did that Serre battlefield look like, and what area did it cover? So just to the north, in the next army sector, was Hebuterne and Gommecourt. Serre was a small little village on rising ground. It sat astride the main Amiens-Arras road, a big important route between those two important cities, which had been effectively cut by the Germans during their advance in this area in 1914. They'd rolled up quite a number of villages in this region, including Serre. The French had fought them at Serre in June of 1915, pushed the German lines back a little bit, but essentially the Germans were still in command of the high ground. Serre, even in 1916, even before the Great War, was a very small village, a hamlet really, and with only a small collection of houses and farms and farm buildings. It sat in open fields with rising ground, with a wooded area just to the north and northwest of the village, where there was a whole series of small copses, and these would eventually straddle the area where the front line would be located. The British, when they came here, named them Matthew, Mark, Luke and John Copse, and these really kind of symbolised the layout of the battlefield here. These small little copses just behind the British front line, with a network of trenches inherited from the French, with new positions dug by the British in the lead up to the Battle of the Somme, and sitting there on the high ground outside of the village, but with the village still above it. So even today, when you go there, it looks as if the copses are up on the ridge, but when you get to the copses, the site of the copses, you've still got a slope ahead of you, and that slope, that critical slope, would be all part of what would unfold here, and how it unfolded on that terrible day of the 1st of July 1916. And then in the southern area of the Serre battlefield, the ground sloped away towards the next village, which was Beaumont-Hamel, and hit another rise there, the Redan Ridge. But beneath the Redan Ridge, close to the Amiens-Arras road, was a German defensive position that they called the Heidenkopf, the Heathen's Head, and that the British called the Quadrilateral. And that sat dominating the ground towards the British positions, behind which was a farm complex called La Signy Farm, and then a network of trenches around that facing the Quadrilateral. And when it came to deciding how the attack would go in here, they had to take all of these different features into consideration: the copses, the high ground, the rising ground around Serre village itself, and the neighbouring Redan Ridge, and the lower slopes which the Quadrilateral sat on, facing the British lines. So eventually elements from 3 separate divisions were detailed to attack here. The 31st Division, more famous because of its Pals Battalions, the 48th South Midland Division, territorial division that had been in France since 1915, served up at Ypres and then moved down to the Somme, and the 4th Division, a regular division. And looking at each of these in turn, the 31st Division was made up of 3 brigades of Pals Battalions, recruited in Lancashire and Yorkshire and Durham. In many ways, it was the very epitome of these Pals Battalions, that phenomena, particularly in the north, but not uniquely in the north, where local communities raised units so that if you came from a particular place, you were promised that you would not be separated from your friends, that you'd all serve together. So places like Accrington and Barnsley and Bradford and Leeds and Sheffield and Hull, they all recruited battalions locally, so that the whole community became involved in the raising of these units and gave up its sons, its brothers, its husbands and its fathers to serve in these units. And the idea of them serving together, this kind of unique phenomena of that early period of the Great War, men would serve together, they'd train together, they'd go overseas together, and they'd go into battle together. And that was the bit that people didn't really consider, and it would have a devastating effect to local communities with the outcome of the fighting here at Serre on the first day of the Somme. The 48th Division, a territorial unit made up of units from the Midland area of Britain, Worcester's and Royal Warwickshire Regiment, and many others besides, Again, as I've said, it's been in France since 1915, served holding the line up at Ypres in front of the Messines Ridge, for example. It, in many ways, was the kind of pre-Pals. So this was a division made up of units recruited locally into these part-time Saturday night soldier battalions of the territorial force, the territorial army as they'd eventually become. And they too could throw communities into mourning if they were sent into battle and suffered heavy casualties. The 4th Division, which was the third and final unit that would fight in this area on the first day of the Somme, being a regular division, was made up of different battalions of different regiments. There was no kind of continuity to its structure, no localization to it, so it wasn't made up of men who represented particular regions of Britain. But it was a battle experience unit that had fought at Le Cateau and the retreat from Mons, and on the fighting in the Aisne in 1914 and the First Battle of Ypres and in the Second Battle of Ypres, and then it had been moved down to the Somme in the summer of 1915 and had been on the Somme front for nearly a year by the time the battle began. Most of its original regular soldiers from that red little dead little army that had been pretty much wiped out in 1914, most of those were gone by the Somme, but there had been men who'd served, been wounded, been promoted, been decorated, returned to units, and they were part of the kind of cadre, really, of many of the battalions within division. So you had section and platoon sergeants and NCOs who were experienced soldiers, officers who'd been promoted, might have been a second lieutenant in 1914, and now they were company or even battalion commanders, and men who'd been battalion commanders who were now brigade commanders. Bertie Prowse is a good example of that, who'd served with the Somerset Light Infantry, commanded one of their battalions in 1914 up at Ypres, and was now the brigade commander in which that Somerset battalion served. So there was a lot of battle experience, different in that respect to the other 2 divisions, which had lots of volunteers, many who might have been at the front for some time, but they'd not seen a major battle before. And the plan here at Serre was to advance in this northern area from the copses into Serre village, take that high ground, take that main Arras road, and then continue to the next major village of Puisieux, north of the Ancre River, take out the defences guarding the main Arras road and the approaches to the next bit of ground. To the south, go across the Redan Ridge to guard the open ground south of Puisieux towards the Ancre River itself, and continue towards Achiettes. There's 2 little Achiettes, Achiette-le-Petit, Achiette-le-Grand, that sit at the junction of roads and railways and were part of the main German supply and communications network. So this was part of a general advance over this wide 18 to 20 mile front to rupture the German line, to push roughly eastwards, northeastwards, and in this area capture the northern area of infrastructure beyond the front line trenches themselves and enable the momentum of that advance to continue. For the 31st Division, in their area of attack from the copses towards Serre village, their divisional commander, Major General Wanless O'Gowan, his view was that the bombardment, this mighty bombardment that would be laid down onto the German trenches, was so powerful that in many ways his men were not actually attacking the Germans. They were simply moving forward to take ground that had already been destroyed and had already been eradicated of Germans by the huge amount of artillery that had been dropped onto it. So his men were not fixing bayonets and really confronting the enemy on the open slopes around Serre. They were just moving forward to capture an objective. So he sent them forward with all of the kit that they would require once they got to these German positions. So picks and shovels. Every other man had a pick or a shovel down the back of his webbing equipment. They had rolls of barbed wire. They had sandbags. They had mallets. They had barbed wire pickets. They had extra ammunition for rifles, for Lewis machine guns, for Vickers machine guns, for Stokes mortars. I mean, all kinds of gear. So these men were loaded up. So even if they'd wanted to run into battle, most of them couldn't because of the amount of gear that they were carrying. And we can look at that critically, and we should look at it critically, but he was, as many generals were, was convinced that with this bombardment, with the huge resources available for this bombardment, totally different to what had happened on the Western Front in the preceding year, that this was the turning point in the war in which artillery would help them win a battle, defeat the enemy, enable an advance to take place. And that belief, that investment, that understanding of the artillery was really still developing. And men like Wanless O'Gowan didn't really understand what artillery could do. It couldn't capture ground. It could enable a unit to move forward and take that position, but the 1st of July would show that artillery alone wasn't enough. So when the attack went in at 7:30 on the 1st of July 1916, 7:30 in the morning, that classic 0 hour for the first day of the Battle of the Somme, in that 31st Division sector, attacking from the copses, with their left flank on the far end of the copses and their right flank towards the Arras Road. The battalions that went forward, with the Leeds Pals and the Bradford Pals on the right, the Accrington Pals, the 11th East Lancs, and the Sheffield City Battalion, the 12th York and Lancs, on the left, with 2 Barnsley Pals, the 13th and the 14th York and Lancs, coming up behind them, and the 18th Durham Light Infantry, the Durham Pals, who were the divisional pioneers. There was a brigade of Hull battalions, 4 battalions of the East Yorkshire Regiment recruited in Hull, and they were in reserve. They were not committed to the initial assault, and they wouldn't actually go into action on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. They'd stand back from the offensive and watch all the others go into the attack. So what happens here then? When those men went over the top and advanced into no man's land, that idea of Wanless O'Gowan's of this just being a move forward to take a position that was already defeated quickly broke down in the experience of the men that were going forward. Reg Glenn, who I interviewed, who was a veteran of the 12th York and Lancs, the Sheffield City Battalion, he was in the signal section and he went forward with one of the infantry platoons, and they'd all been told that nothing was going to survive this bombardment. And then ahead of them on the high ground towards Serre village, they started to see the flashes of machine guns and rifle fire, and he saw men disappear into the grass, because no man's land here at Serre wasn't particularly heavily bombarded, and so it was just a big overgrown field with this waist-high grass, and he saw men disappear into that, thinking that an officer had given an instruction to take cover, so he did likewise. What he was actually seeing was the German machine guns traversing the lines of those Sheffield City Battalion men and mowing them down, and he just ducked at the right moment. And that kind of experience went across all of those different battalions as they attempted to move across no man's land. When you go there today and you stand on the track near to where the copses were and you look out and see the battlefield cemeteries that were out in the old no man's land, in many respects you're seeing the high tide mark of most of those battalions' attacks there on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. The Leeds Pals, most of them, only got a few yards from their own trenches before they were taken apart by German machine gun fire, trench mortar fire, artillery fire. The lethality of the German reaction here was just terrible for these attacking units, and they melted away very, very quickly. John Harris wrote the book on the Sheffield City Battalion's Covenant with Death, a novel. He didn't serve in the Great War. As a journalist many decades later in Sheffield, he got to know many of the veterans. And in that book, he has this classic phrase, which I think really sums up the experience of these pals here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. 2 years in the making, 10 minutes in the destruction. That was our history. And for most of these battalions, that is exactly what happened. So this whole idea of men serving together, training together, going overseas together, going into the trenches together, and now going over the top together would lead to whole communities in that northern part of Great Britain, in Yorkshire and Lancashire, being thrown into mourning as a consequence of these terrible casualties here on the first day of the Somme. And of all the battalions that went over the top in this area, only the Accrington Pals and a small party of men from the Durham Pals got into the German positions. The Accrington Pals got into a part of the German front line, bombed their way and Lewis gunned their way down the communication trench, and then were eventually thrown back. Lieutenant Colonel Rickman, who commanded the battalion, had to order withdrawal from those positions when it was quite clear that all of the other attacks around him had failed and he was in an isolated position, and what was left of his battalion could be annihilated if he stayed there. So they pulled back, and at the end of that day there was nothing to show for all of that sacrifice. In the southern part of that Somme battlefield, the 48th South Midland Division and the 4th Division at the Quadrilateral, they sent units into the attack towards that German redoubt, the Heidenkopf. Brigadier General Bertie Prowse's 11th Brigade, supported by territorial battalions of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment from that South Midland Division, had a two-pronged attack on the Quadrilateral, with those regular battalions of the Somersets and the Hampshires, the Essex, and across to the Rifle Brigade, supported by the territorial lads from the Royal Warwicks. They were going in a pincer movement towards the Quadrilateral, but the Germans had survived the bombardment and laid down lethal machine gun fire. When you stand on the edge of where the Quadrilateral was today and you look up the slopes just above you where the Warwick's lads came in, you can see how those slopes became murder slopes, really, for the battalions that were moving forward in the initial phase of that attack. And the losses in Bertie Prowse's 11th Brigade were so severe, all of the battalion commanders became casualties, the majority of the company commanders, many of the platoon commanders, so the whole kind of leadership structure broke down very quickly indeed, and Bertie Prowse was no kind of chateau general, so he went forward, got into the line, got across no man's land, got into the German trenches, where he was mortally wounded and died that evening in a casualty clearing station, the most senior British officer to become a casualty on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Redan Ridge, just beyond, where the remaining part of the 4th Division went into the attack, was a vast area of open ground as it is today, rising up to a crest of the Redan Ridge itself, and taking any assaulting troops across that ground towards the southern area just south of the village of Serre. But the open nature of the ground and the fact that the attacks to the north failed, and then across in the next divisional sector the attacks there failed too. Lethal fire came down on the units that were advancing here, but incredibly a party of the Essex Regiment got through to just south of Serre village itself and were never seen again. The men were all killed or taken prisoner. So for the whole attack here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the attack to the north with the Pals, the attack in the centre and on the right towards the Redan Ridge and around the Quadrilateral with the territorials and the regular battalions, all of this had failed. The 31st Division had suffered over 3,600 casualties out of about 5,000 men who had gone into battle at 0 hour on the 1st of July. The 4th Division had over 5,700 casualties in the attack on the Quadrilateral, which is something like 10% of the overall casualties on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, just in that one area. So you can see from the Arras Road, the Quadrilateral across the Redan Ridge was one of the most deadliest areas on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And you've got to add to that casualty list the names of all those Warwick's lads who've been killed supporting them in the assault on the Quadrilateral. And sadly, as nightfall fell across that Serre and Redan Ridge battlefield, despite all the hope, despite the Pals Battalions and everything that they stood for, Serre had been a bloody failure. To the south of Serre was the village of Beaumont-Hamel, a much larger village than Serre itself. It sat at the junction of a number of local roads. To the south was the Ancre River and the railway line that ran from Amiens to Lille via Arras, no longer running, of course, during the war itself at this point. But it sat in a hollow, the village of Beaumont-Hamel, with high ground all around it. To the north was the Redan Ridge in that neighbouring sector towards Serre, and to the west was the Hawthorne Ridge, and to the south was the rising ground that then straddled the high point, which led down to the Ancre River Valley in front of the village of Hamel itself. The British positions here were facing all of these bits of high ground. No man's land could be quite wide. There was a section just west of Beaumont-Hamel where the distance between the British front line and the German positions on the edge of the village where it was wooded was quite considerable. But in the middle, as was common on the kind of chalk downland of the Somme, was a sunken lane that ran from south to north, cut through some fields and field divides and embankments on this part of the battlefield. And the geography there would give the British an opportunity to annex that sunken lane and the ground around it to create a jumping off point where their troops could advance much nearer to Beaumont-Hamel village and the German defences itself. There was no such luxury on Hawthorne Ridge, which was a big expanse of open ground. Probably by the middle of 1916, any trace of that hawthorn tree that had been on that ridge was pretty much blasted away, and the position was dominated by the Hawthorne Redoubt, a German defensive position that had incredible fields of fire from there down into the area around the sunken lane, down towards the British frontline positions, across the valley towards the Redan Ridge and even as far across as Serre, and then to the south towards over the top of that rising ground towards the valley area as well. So it dominated that part of the battlefield. To the south of the Hawthorne Redoubt was an old quarry, an old prehistoric quarry probably, the shape of a Y, called the Y Ravine by the British, that snaked back to the village of Beaumont-Hamel. The Germans had dug into that, they had dugouts there, they had tunnels linking the ravine to their frontline trenches, and the positions there had very good fields of fire in that open landscape on those high points north of the river valley itself. So essentially, as with all of these locations, the Germans were very much dominating the ground, and what the British had here, the positions that they held, were all inherited from the French, who had done very little in this part of the line to redress the balance once those positions had been formed in the early battles of 1914. The British unit that would take part in the attack at Beaumont-Hamel was the British 29th Division. This was another regular army unit that didn't exist before the war. Its battalions, its original battalions, were made up of units that were in the far-flung corners of the British Empire and were recalled to Britain on the outbreak of war, probably thinking they were about to go off to fight at Mons or First Ypres or wherever it was, but in fact they were assembled to be sent to Egypt, and then from Egypt to Gallipoli, and they'd taken part in the entire Gallipoli campaign from the original landings at Cape Helles on the 25th of April 1915 through to the final evacuation in January of 1916. So that meant that the original personnel, the regular soldiers of the 29th Division, had found their graves at Gallipoli, sadly, and a bit like the 4th Division at Serre, having been in so many engagements, most of its original personnel were long gone, but men had been wounded at Gallipoli, gone sick at Gallipoli, because that was a big problem there, recovered, and then returned to the unit, and again were acting as senior NCOs, platoon commanders, now company commanders, and all the other ways in which experienced veterans would find themselves being promoted on account of they were amongst the few survivors from those early battles. And the staff within the division had learnt a lot from the attacks at Gallipoli, some of which they tried to apply to the attack here at Beaumont-Hamel. One of the things at Gallipoli is that it was difficult sometimes to observe the advance of troops. So the division had used triangles. The divisional flash was a red triangle, and at Gallipoli they'd made triangles out of biscuit tin and put them on the backs of British soldiers' packs. So when they went forward, they would glint in the Gallipoli sunshine, and the observers from divisional or brigade staff could see how far forward men had gone. And they did a similar thing here, thinking that the kind of conditions of trench warfare and battles would be similar to Gallipoli. They discovered that they weren't. It was more complex. The network of trenches they were up against were more complex, and the kind of enemy they were fighting, as good as the Turks were, and they were excellent soldiers at Gallipoli, they weren't really on a par with what was behind the Imperial German Army in terms of manpower, in terms of firepower, and all the industry that was behind that to keep them in the field. It was a very different battlefield altogether. The commander of the 29th Division was Major General Beaurevoir de Lisle. He'd been a cavalry officer at the beginning of the war. He'd fought at Audregnies in 1914, for example, during one of the major cavalry assaults there. And he'd gone on to command the 29th Division at Gallipoli and then here on the Western Front. He was considered a good commander by his men, a fair commander. He listened to new ideas. He listened to junior officers. But this was a period in which the British Army was still understanding, still beginning to come to terms with how warfare on the Western Front was really fought. So Beaurevoir de Lisle was all part of that learning curve and the men involved in that learning curve in 1916. Learning perhaps as they did, but always at a cost in men's lives. But the 29th Division did a few things slightly differently to some of the other units that attacked on the first day of the Somme, possibly based on some of their Gallipoli experience. They had raw horse artillery batteries in the 29th Division with 13-pounder field guns, light field guns, and they were able to bring them far forward and use them to lay down a heavy shrapnel bombardment onto the German wire. So wire cutting wasn't as much of a problem in some areas of the 29th Division assault as it was in other parts of the line on that first day of the Battle of the Somme. They also used a lot of saps, so a sap was dug from the original British front line into that sunken lane that we've mentioned to essentially annex the sunken lane and send men from the Lancashire Fusiliers into there with trench mortars and machine guns to make their attack there at 0 hour on the 1st of July 1916. But in many other parts of the 29th Division assault, saps were used to create tunnels under no man's land with exits at the far end to enable troops to move safely underground and then pop up much nearer to the German positions. And with the explosion of a mine on their divisional front, the Hawthorne mine, which took many months to dig and resulted in 40,000 pounds of ammonite explosive being placed under the German positions beneath that Hawthorne redoubt on the crest of Hawthorne Ridge with the intention of blowing it to smithereens in the lead up to the attack. There was an argument as to how the mine would be used. Some were in favour of blowing it an hour before the attack, some at the point in which the attack would take place. The eventual compromise over these arguments was 10 minutes before 0. So this mine would go off at 7:20 a.m. And Beaurevoir de Lisle thought there was enough of a window there for potentially the Germans to occupy the crater. So a party of raw fusiliers, machine gunners and trench mortars were rushed across no man's land as soon as the mine went off to occupy the British side of the crater and defend it against all comers. And those all comers pretty much quickly turned up, and there was a firefight almost immediately. The main assault then went in on the left at the sunken lane with the Lancashire Fusiliers, with 2 companies attacking from the lane itself, supported by the machine gunners and the trench mortars, and the remainder of the battalion coming behind. That battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Magniac, the Maniac his men called him, who would be awarded a Distinguished Service Order for his bravery there on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. When you go to the sunken lane today, and it's one of the most evocative places on that part of the Somme battlefields, and you stand there in the lane and you look at the footage that Geoffrey Malins, the cinematographer, took in the early hours of the 1st of July, showing the men assembled there, waiting to attack, and the photographs that were taken there, and you look around you, you climb up onto the lip of the sunken lane, and you walk towards Beaumont-Hamel. Just ahead of you is an old field divide, a sheer escarpment, a slope, and behind that today is Beaumont-Hamel British Cemetery. And again, a bit like the cemeteries up at Serre and also Redan Ridge, it pretty much marks the high tide of the Lancashire Fusiliers' advance. They lost more than 450 men within a few yards of that sunken lane and brought that attack to a standstill. Up on the Hawthorne Ridge itself, following the explosion of the mine, the advance party ends up in a firefight with the Germans. German defenders, the 119th Reserve Infantry Regiment, Württemberg unit from Stuttgart that had been there since the autumn of 1914 and knew this ground intimately, Coming up behind was the rest of the Royal Fusiliers, the Dublin Fusiliers, some of the Monmouth lads going forward with Bangalore torpedoes to blow lanes in any belts of the German wire that had not been cut by the shrapnel. They all come under murderous fire. And again, that phrase that you could use again and again and again on the 1st of July, these battalions melt away under that fire. And one of the reserve units here was the 16th Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment, the Public Schools Battalion, and they were over on the other side of the valley from the Hawthorne Ridge, behind the sunken lane in a position called the White City. They assembled there, moved across the open ground towards the ridge and headed straight for the crater. And in assaulting that position, the battalion was almost wiped out. There's some film captured by Malins of groups of ant-like figures going up the ridge towards the crater and just a handful coming back. Lieutenant Colonel Hamilton Hall, commanding 16th Middlesex, was the only officer of that battalion to walk away from that action. The rest of them were all killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. With the attacks at the Sunken Lane and Hawthorne Ridge faltering with all these heavy losses, to the south, around that Wye ravine, the assault went in there with 2 assault battalions, the 2nd Battalion South Wales Borderers and the 1st Border Regiment behind them. They ceased to exist in the first 30 minutes of the battle, according to the British official historian. And the reserves in that area, the Newfoundland Regiment, which was a unit that joined the 29th Division at Gallipoli and had served on Caribou Hill in the Suvla Bay sector and was now going into battle for the very first time in a direct assault. On their flank was the 1st Battalion of the Essex Regiment. Those two were the battle reserves sent forward, and as they attempted to move up, they found the communication trenches clogged with the wounded coming back from the first 2 waves from the South Wales Borderers and the Border Regiment. The Essex stuck to their trenches, moved up, found it very difficult going, and then sent 2 companies into battle. And on their left, the Newfoundland Regiment going forward, experiencing the same kind of problems in moving through the communication trenches. Their battalion commander made a decision to come up out of the trenches and begin their advance from there. And what he didn't realise is the German machine gunners on the other side of no man's land could see him, laid down indirect machine gun fire onto him, and Newfoundlanders were killed and wounded even before they got to their own front line. When they got through the wire, or tried to get through the wire in front of their own positions, the same machine guns cut them to pieces there. There was a tree on another one of these field divides, a little embankment out in no man's land that became known as the Danger Tree because the ground there was swept by machine gun and shell fire. And by the time the Newfoundland Regiment got there, it was pretty much a leaderless attack that broke down in the shell holes out in no man's land, and a few men got to near the German wire where they exchanged a few bombs. Of around 800 men that went into battle from the Newfoundland Regiment, and the exact number that went over the top and the exact scale of casualties is debated heavily to this day. But if we use the figures that in the official history, and I think Martin Middlebrook uses these as well, it gives us an insight into the terrible tragedy of the Newfoundland Regiment on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Of those 800 or so that went into battle, 710 became casualties. So a mere handful walked away on that evening of the 1st of July 1916. And that really brought the attacks in this area to a standstill. All they had to show was groups of men out in no man's land who that night began to connect up some of the shell holes, and eventually over the next few days and next few weeks, a new trench was dug out in no man's land, roughly cutting off about half of no man's land between the British frontline positions and the Wye ravine, but at great cost. If you look at the whole divisional front, from the Sunken Lane area across to the Hawthorne Ridge and Redoubt, across to the area around the Wye ravine, the 29th Division, Beaurevoir de Lisle's men lost 223 officers and over 5,000 men there on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And all there was, as nightfall fell on that part of the battlefield, all there was to show was the creation of a new trench just a few yards across no man's land, and casualties that in many ways made Gallipoli look like a picnic in comparison. The third battlefield location in this area of Somme North is the village of Thiepval and the ground that surrounds it. This was in the attack area of the 10th Corps on the 1st of July, commanded by Lieutenant General Sir T.L.N. Morland, probably one of the lesser-known figures of the first day of the Somme. And while his planning and preparation would lead to some of the outcomes here on that 1st of July 1916, he's not one of those that seems to have got more directly involved in the battle compared to some of the other commanders in this northern sector of the Somme. The battlefield at Thiepval covered quite a wide area. It began really in the Ancre Valley, where the Ancre River is and where the railway line runs from Amiens to Albert, up to Arras and eventually to Lille, with obviously the line cut by the creation of the front lines there in the early period of the Great War. It then rises up to a high point on the southern side of the Ancre Valley to a big area that drops away to the next village in that area of Grandcourt, and as the ground drops away, that is a position where the Germans sited one of their major defensive works, the Schwaben Redoubt, on the reverse slope of a hill facing towards where the enemy positions were, originally the French and then eventually the British. And then it curves, the high ground curves round. Thiepval village sits on the very crest of that high ground. In 1914, it was one of the largest villages on the Somme, dominated by a large chateau, lots of terraced housing there for people who worked in the chateau estate, a very wealthy village in some respects and a prosperous one, and one that sat on this high point that looked across the Ancre Heights, as they would eventually become known, down towards that river valley. And generations of French families had grown up there, had worked and farmed there, had worked for the chateau estate, and the peace and tranquility of that setting had been disturbed by war in 1914, and the Germans had rolled all this up. And the positions that they moved to in those early battles on the crest of what became known as the Thiepval Ridge enabled them to dominate the ground, looking down towards the Allied positions, again first the French and then the British. There was a big area of woodland just behind those Allied positions, Thiepval Wood, and then behind that the marshes of the Ancre and the continuation of the river and where the railway line ran. And the Germans had dug in and dug deep here. Some of the dugouts were tens of feet beneath the surface. There was a massive network of trenches. The Germans had created machine gun positions in their second and third line to lay down fire up over the battlefield, down onto potential kill zones where an enemy might attack. The ruins of the chateau gave advantage, defensive point, and also observational advantage towards Thiepval Wood, and any assault that would come towards that position, towards the village, in any attack, as it would do on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, would be seen from those positions, and there would be a sheer slope for that enemy, for the British, to move up if they made an assault there. So we can see in this Somme North area, like so many areas of the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the advantage was really strongly in favour of the Germans, and the British were always attacking up some kind of slope towards German positions on the top or just over the crest of the high ground ahead of them, where those attacking forces, if anyone had survived in those defences, the attackers would be skylined and cut to pieces by anyone who'd survived in those trenches and redoubts and machine gun posts and everything else that was on that part of the battlefield. The British approach to the battlefield was through the village of Hamel in the Ancre Valley to the left, and one brigade of the Ulster Division that would attack here would occupy that area. They could move up through the dense mass of Thiepval Wood that stood on a slope leading down to that marshland and river valley area, and also come up through the village of Auteuil on the right to get up to the ground immediately south of Thiepval village in the divide between the Thiepval sector and the next part of the Somme front, which we'll look at in Somme Central. The plan here was to advance up that Ancre Valley, meet up with the advancing troops who would be taking Serre, Poisieux, Beaumont-Hamel and the ground north of the Ancre Valley, continue with that advance in the northern part of the battlefield and help secure the centre positions to the south for the troops that would be advancing there, all part of this general push forward across the high ground of the Somme, beyond the trenches, into the open ground beyond, and who knows where that would take them. The divisions that would fight here on the first day of the Somme in front of Thiepval, we've already mentioned one of them, the 36th Ulster Division, formed in 1914 from battalions of the Royal Irish Rifles and the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers, many of them Pals Battalions from places like Belfast. They'd been on the Western Front since 1915, but this was their first time in action. And for Ulster, like all those places in the north of England, for example, Accrington, Barnsley, Sheffield, Leeds, this was their chance to prove what the sons of Ulster could do on this world stage of the Battle of the Somme. On their flanks was the 32nd Division, which was a new army division, Kitchener's Army Division, made up of a lot of different battalions and different regiments. It had some POWs units in it, like the Salford POWs, the 15th and the 16th and the 19th Battalions of the Lancashire Fusiliers, 1st, 2nd, 3rd Salford POWs. There was the 16th Battalion Northumberland Fusiliers, the Newcastle Commercials, but there were some regular battalions within the division as well, like the 1st Dorsets and the 2nd Battalion King's Own Yorkshire Line Infantry. So it's quite a mixed unit. And supporting the Ulster Division sector within that big mass of Thiepval Wood was the 49th West Riding Division, which was a Yorkshire Territorial Division with battalions of the West Yorkshire Regiment and the York and Lancs, and the Duke of Wellington's regiment, the West Riding Regiment, and they'd served at Ypres in 1915, where they'd come up against one of the very first major phosgene gas attacks. Then they'd been moved down to the Somme, and they were in reserve for the Ulster Division attack, although some of their troops would be committed to the fight on the 1st of July 1916. One of the interesting elements with the attack here is that battalions of both the Ulster Division and the 32nd Division actually left their trenches before 0 hour. So they didn't wait for the whistles to blow at 7:30, go up the ladders and go into action. They actually sent men forward before the bombardment of the German positions had ceased. And this was different to other sectors. It meant that men were often halfway or even 2/3 of the way across no man's land before the barrage lifted. And that meant, for example, on the front of the Ulster Division, their troops got into the German positions very quickly. The wire cutting was quite effective in most parts of the line here, where the Ulster Division went into action, and the troops from the Royal Irish Rifle and the Inniskilling Fusilier battalions got into the German trenches and fought their way through. And in that central area towards the Schwaben Redoubt, that big defensive network, the men got into that within the first hour of the battle. Now, one thing the Germans are always very good at, and this was part of that wider kind of Württemberg Army Corps on this northern part of the Somme battlefield, were counterattacks. And as soon as it was realised that the British, and they didn't differentiate between Ulstermen or Commonwealth troops to the Germans, everyone was dear Tommies, the British. Once the Germans realised the British had got into a position like the Schwaben Redoubt, immediate counterattacks went in. They utilised their artillery, which had not been destroyed in the preliminary bombardment, to drop down a box barrage onto no man's land between Thiepval Wood and the German frontline positions, which had been captured by the Ulster troops, cutting them off, certainly temporarily. And then the counterattacks went in to try and drive the Ulster battalions back out of the Schwaben, back out of the positions around a trench known as the Pope's Nose, and push them back into Thiepval Wood. On the other side of the valley, the brigade that attacked there of the Ulster Division from Hamel across the high ground following the line of the river, some of their troops got through and they got as far as Beaucourt, some got to Beaucourt Station, but they were in such small numbers that they had no real effect on the outcome of the fighting there on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. But the biggest battle of all was for that position in and around the Schwaben Redoubt, where Ulstermen ran out of ammunition, ran out of bombs, grenades, were using German weapons, German hand grenades, running out of water in those hot conditions of the 1st of July, and desperately trying to cling on to the positions that they had taken. It was an inevitability that the bulk of the Ulster Division's success was eventually overrun. Men were pushed back, and by nightfall, despite that some units of the West Riding Division had come up to assist, the 1st, 5th York and Lancs, for example, moved up. The 1st, 4th Hallamsheres of the York and Lancs also moved up to assist some of the Ulster Division positions. Despite that, they'd only succeeded in capturing a foothold in those German positions. But of course, if we compare it to the sectors further north, up towards Beaumont-Hamel and Serre, nothing had been captured there. So the capture of part of the German forward positions was quite significant here on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and gave units in this sector a foothold to continue with the battle, as the men of the 49th West Riding Division did indeed do over the coming days. On the right, towards Thiepval village itself, and a position just to the south around a quarry known as the Leipzig Redoubt, the 32nd Division attacked there. Also, many of their troops moving forward before 0 hour, getting out into no man's land. But the classic attack up that slope towards the Thiepval Chateau and the bulk of Thiepval village by the men of those Salford Pals Battalions that we mentioned, supported by the Newcastle Commercials. They moved out into no man's land. The Württemberg machine gunners of the 180th Regiment laid down murderous fire down those slopes towards those attacking battalions, and yet again they melted away under that fire, and the attack there completely failed. Some of the units on the southern part of the battlefield around the Leipzig Redoubt got into the German positions, and again this kind of gave a foothold for the battle to continue. But the breakthrough and the capture of this key position, this high point on the Thiepval Ridge, just did not happen on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And while footholds would enable the fight to continue, and eventually over the coming weeks and months, gradually this ground would be clawed back from the Germans, it wasn't taken in a single day. And the result here, like so many other parts of the Somme front, were terrible, terrible losses. The Ulster Division suffered over 5,100 casualties on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. Their neighbours, the 32nd Division, nearly 4,000 casualties in the fight there. And the 49th Division, having only a minor part in the first day of the Somme battle, suffered nearly 600 casualties in their attempt to support the Ulstermen in the capture and consolidation of that German forward position that had been taken just across no man's land from Thiepval Wood. And when we discuss casualties in places like this, the numbers are mind-boggling in some respects. I mean, it's nearly 9,500 casualties in this ground, from the Ancre Valley in front of Hamel across to the Schwaben Redoubt to Thiepval village in the Leipzig Redoubt area. But when we examine those casualties, over 4,500 of them were men killed in action. That's almost 50% of the total. In most battles, about 1 in 5 were killed and 3 in 5 were wounded in the infantry. In this battle, nearly half the casualties were dead. And that gives you some idea of the ferocity of the fighting and the ability in places like this of German machine guns to mow down men in no man's land as they tried to move up slopes towards an entrenched enemy. So with just a few footholds in the German line, the attack here at Thiepval came to an end with these terrible, terrible losses. When we come to this northern area of the Somme battlefields today, we could walk Somme North, the ground that we've discussed in this episode, in an afternoon, starting at Serre, walking across that area where the small battlefield cemeteries mark the advance of the Pals on the 1st of July, across to where the Heidenkopf, the quadrilateral, had once been located, close to the massive Serre Road No. 2 cemetery, go over the Redan Ridge, where again small battlefield cemeteries, Redan 1, 2 and 3, mark where the 4th Division made their attack there on the 1st of July, walk down through the sunken lane where Colonel Magniac's men made their attack in those early hours of the first day of the Somme, walk up onto the Hawthorne Ridge and see the now opened up crater by the Hawthorne Crater Association, really bringing that part of the battlefield to life once more, cross over the Hawthorne Ridge No. 1 cemetery, where young Eric Heaton, one of those lads in the 16th Middlesex Regiment where he was killed and where he's buried, whose story I've told on this podcast before, walk into the area of the Newfoundland Park, as it's known now, where the men of the 29th Division, including the Newfoundland Regiment, attack the area around the Wye Ravine, and it's now a permanent memorial to those terrible losses in the Newfoundland Regiment on the 1st of July 1916, which would become a national day of mourning for Newfoundland, and when they become part of Canada post-Second World War, with perhaps even greatest symbolism because the 1st of July is Canada Day. So it's a day that hangs heavy over that part of the Somme battlefield, and we could continue from there down into the village of Hamel, cross over the Ancre Valley, through those marshes, beneath Thiepval Wood, and go up to the ground where the Schwaben Redoubt was, over into Thiepval village, and then come out on the far side with the mighty Thiepval Memorial that commemorates the missing of the Somme is located, and beyond that, that little quarry with a little small area of woodland around it marking the site of the Leipzig Redoubt. And in that brief moment of time, a brief afternoon on the Somme, the open landscape of 1916, we've walked that deadly, deadly ground of Somme North. More than 25,000 casualties from Serre down to the ground south of Thiepval. One part of the Somme, one part of that terrible tragedy of the 1st of July 1916, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, and an area that has so much poignancy today when we come to these places that speak to the very heart, I think, of that old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.